Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Good Friday 2020 episode of the KMG show. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Well, that was the famous line by Johnny Rotten at the end of the last Sex Pistols concert, which was in San Francisco. I came across this story, which is rather shocking, although perhaps it's not shocking. Perhaps nothing is shocking anymore. Senator Dr. Jensen's shocking admission about coronavirus. Scott Jensen is a Minnesota physician, and he is a state senator. And he was sent a document by the from the Centers for Disease Control. And I'll read from a story from the Minnesota Star Tribune. State Senator Scott Jensen, a physician and Republican from Chaska, has criticized the state health department for following federal guidance on when doctors should characterize deaths as due to COVID-19. His concern that the direction might push doctors to overdiagnose COVID-19, inflate the death toll, and prolong the invasive social distancing measures. Well, they went to Il Duce for a response. Among those strongly disagreeing with Jensen's argument on Thursday was Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and a leader of the federal COVID-19 response. There is absolutely no evidence that that's the case at all, said Fauci, responding in a televised NBC interview to the general theory. I think it falls under the category of something that is very unfortunate, these conspiracy theories that we hear about. While treating physicians or medical examiners declare causes of death, they routinely receive guidance from health authorities on how to make those decisions, particularly when new cause of death codes are added to the International Classification of Diseases Guidebook. The code for COVID-19 was added April the 1st. The latest federal guidance sought to increase consistency in reporting of COVID-19 deaths, which helps define the scope and breadth of the pandemic, said Jan Malcolm, State Health Commissioner. So I found the PDF. It is dated report number 3, April 2020, Vital Statistics Reporting Guidance. This is from cdc.gov. And Dr. Jensen was particularly upset with page 6 of this document. Scenario 3, an 86-year-old female with an unconfirmed case of COVID-19. An 86-year-old female passed away at home. Her husband reported that she was non-ambulatory after suffering an ischemic stroke 3 years ago. He stated that 5 days prior, she developed a high fever and severe cough after being exposed to an ill family member who subsequently was diagnosed with COVID-19. Despite his urging, she refused to go to the hospital even when her breathing became more labored and temperature escalated. She was unresponsive that morning and her husband phoned emergency medical services. Upon EMS arrival, the patient was pulseless and apneic. Her husband stated that he and his wife had advanced directives and that she was not to be resuscitated. After consulting with medical command, she was pronounced dead and the coroner was notified. Comment. Although no testing was done, the coroner determined that the likely UCOD was COVID-19, given the patient's symptoms and exposure to an infected individual. Therefore, COVID-19 was reported on the lowest line used in Part 1. Her ischemic stroke was considered a factor that contributed to her death, but it was not part of the direct causal sequence in Part 1, so it was reported in Part 2. So here we have a confirmed case leading to U.S. federal government guidance that even people who have not tested positive for COVID-19, and even when it cannot be determined that COVID-19 was the cause of death, coroners should put on death certificates that COVID-19 was the cause. So it appears clear to me, it appears to be proved that the U.S. federal government is determined to exaggerate the numbers of COVID-19 deaths. Jensen tweeted April the 7th, See page 6 and make your own determination as to whether or not physicians are being encouraged to utilize COVID-19 in cause of death diagnoses. So, a tweet from Mark Simone. Look at how ridiculously wrong all the COVID-19 models were. The purple dotted line are the actual numbers. And, the Columbia University model, as of March 29th, 136,000 total COVID beds, New York City only. The McKinsey state severe scenario, 110,000 statewide. Gates funded IHME as of April 1st, 73,000. And it is nowhere near that. As of 20 hours ago, it was 18,279. Panic is being stoked in New York State, across America, and across the world. For what purposes? Well, I suppose we can only speculate. Scott Gottlieb, MD, writes on Twitter, there's uncertainty how many Americans were already exposed to COVID-19 and developed immunity. Until we do widespread serological testing to see who has antibodies, we won't know for sure. Experts' models put number in single digits, perhaps 2 to 5% of the U.S. population. The excellent Trevor Bedford of The Hutch had a good thread on this yesterday. I'll recap and build on some of his characteristically insightful points. Bedford had written, how can we assess the total number of SARS-CoV-2 infections that have occurred up to this point? As others have noted, it's not easy to extrapolate from confirmed cases to total infections. Gottlieb continues, serology, testing for antibodies people produce after being exposed to COVID-19, tells you where you've been. It doesn't tell you where you're going. In other words, it reveals where infection has spread, but doesn't diagnose active infection or tell you where it's spreading. Serology surveys can have value. For example, they inform public health decisions. If local population has high incidence of prior exposure and some immunity to COVID-19, then measures you take in setting of outbreak may be more austere versus area where prior exposure was minimal. Serology surveys can also inform workforce decisions. In some professions where there's a lot of exposure to people, healthcare workers, food handlers, TSA agents, there could be higher prior exposure and rates of some immunity. That can help some people return to work sooner. But serology shouldn't be used to try and diagnose active infection. For that, given the current technology we have, we need PCR-based tests that screen for active virus. Serology should only be relied upon for telling you who has already been infected. So how many people have been exposed to COVID-19 and have antibodies? This report estimates total number of infections in different European countries based on observed cases and deaths, generally finding between 1 and 15% of the population was infected. And Austria 1.1%, Belgium 3.7%, Denmark 1.1%, France 3.0%, Germany 0.72%, Italy 9.8%, Norway 0.41%, Spain 15%, Sweden 3.1%, Switzerland 3.2%, and the United Kingdom 2.7%. In the US, experts suggest to me that the rate is lower. My informal survey of thought leaders in this area puts estimate anywhere from 1 to 5%. Ultimately, we must confirm this with serology studies, which are underway, but it falls short of the 50 to 70% needed to achieve herd immunity. Now, juking the stats, that's clearly what's going on here. Again, to produce a panic. There is a hashtag trending on Twitter, end the shutdown. Captain Bam Bam tweets, nobody trusts the World Health Organization. We want our country and freedoms back. The response to this end the shutdown hashtag in Twitter was absolute fury. Absolute fury. And this was the result of Russian bots. Yes, everyone who disagrees with me is a Russian bot. Just people screaming obscenities along the lines of, how dare you? How dare you talk about putting America and the rest of the world back to work? We have our we have our models. And the models are all over the place. And the most famous model from Dr. Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London is a black box. We don't know what's inside. We only know the results, which initially were absolutely catastrophic. Wes Free tweets, good news continues in New York. Hospitalizations down, ICU admissions negative, intubations down way below forecasts. Alan G. Forsyth, of course not. The Stasi or RCMP only care about policing when it involves restricting the civil liberties of law-abiding citizens. This was in response to a tweet that said, that is odd. When the eco-terrorists were holding up trains and creating fires on train tracks, the RCMP said they couldn't do nothing about it. Well, yeah. Those were politically protected protests, not people simply, I don't know, wanting to go for a walk, you know? So, is Trump going to reopen the country on May the 1st or thereabouts? Well, what he had to say today was not particularly encouraging, but Trump does a lot of A/B testing. Trump throws ideas out there. He, as they say, he runs things up the flagpole and see whether anyone salutes. So according to CNBC, he said that he would not reopen the economy until we know this country is going to be healthy. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reportedly projected that lifting stay-at-home orders, school closures, and school distancing after just 30 days would lead to an infection spike this summer, according to documents first reported by the New York Times. Trump said, we're looking at a date. We hope we'll be able to fulfill a certain date, but we're not doing anything until we know this country is going to be healthy. We don't want to go back and start doing it all over again, even though it would be in a smaller scale. Trump said he also plans to announce an Opening Our Country Council on Tuesday, comprised of business leaders and doctors and potentially governors that will help determine how to reopen the economy. I've gained great respect for governors, both Republican and Democrat. Trump said, I've actually become friends with some of the Democrat governors that I wouldn't have really had the privilege of getting to know. He added that he wants the state's governors to ultimately decide whether to reopen parts of the country, but said he has great authority if he wanted to use it, and said the question of when to ease social distancing restrictions will be the biggest decision he's ever made. Quote, I don't know that I've had a bigger decision, but I'm going to surround myself with the greatest minds, not only the greatest minds, but the greatest minds in numerous different businesses, including the business of politics and reason, and we're going to make a decision. Hopefully, it's going to be the right decision. I want to get it open as soon as possible. This country was meant to be open and vibrant. I would love to open it. I'm not determined to do anything. The facts will determine what I do, but we do want to get our country open. Dr. Anthony Fauci said that whenever governments begin to pull back restrictions, there could be a resurgence in new cases. The goal at that point would be to quickly identify new cases, isolate infected people, and contact trace or determine the origin of infection. I don't know. Seems to me that we're looking for a showdown, coming to a showdown here between Trump and Fauci. Trump also said that the U.S. will have substantially under 100,000 deaths from coronavirus, lower than initial estimates. The minimum number was 100,000 lives, and I think we'll be substantially under that number. Hard to believe that if you had 60,000, you can never be happy, but that's a lot fewer than we were originally told and thinking. Trump said early estimates indicated the U.S. could have 100,000 to 220,000 deaths from the coronavirus and up to 2.2 million if the U.S. didn't take any action to control the pandemic. He said states like New York have recently reported declining hospital admissions, and nationwide, the number of new cases is flattening. He added that hard-hit cities like Detroit and New Orleans appear to be stabilizing. Trump said the U.S. is getting to the point where people can start considering doing elective surgeries or non-essential operations. White House Coronavirus Task Force Coordinator Dr. Deborah Birx said that a lot of improvements have been made in the New York City area, which for a time accounted for over half the cases in the U.S. Birx said cases are still occurring in the Boston and Chicago areas, but the rate of increase in cases also appears to be stabilizing. Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's health il duce, added that it's important to remember that this is not the time to pull back restrictions imposed to control the spread of the coronavirus. He also said that if governments begin to pull back restrictions too soon, there's a chance the virus could resurge and infect more people. I'm guessing that Dr. Fauci is not what you'd call a glass half full kind of fellow. So what else is going on in finance? A good day for the Dow Jones. It was up 286 points, 1.2%. The VIX, which is the Scaredy Cat Index, was down 1.68 or 3.9%. Wow. Facebook spent $23.4 million in 2009 on Mark Zuckerberg's security and private air travel. You know, Elizabeth Holmes was very much influenced by this. She had a squad of people, guards, around her at all times to let everyone know just what a big shot she was. As the coronavirus takes hold in Detroit, pandemic magnifies city's poverty, racial disparities. Yes, world coming to end. Minorities, women hit hardest. I mean, they can't resist. They simply can't resist. Oh, yes, that report again. New U.S. projections show summer coronavirus infections spike if restrictions are lifted. Again, we don't know how many people have it. We don't know how many people have had it. We don't know how many people have been exposed to it. And as far as what the numbers were last month and in February, January, and even December, we are never going to know. So these people are talking out of their hat. If President Donald Trump lifts shelter-in-place orders after 30 days, the death toll is estimated to reach 200,000, the New York Times reported, citing new projections it obtained from the Departments of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services. The April 9 projections did not have dates for when shelter-in-place orders were delivered or dates for when spikes would hit, according to the New York Times. The projections outlined different scenarios without any restrictions imposed to contain coronavirus, including school closings, shelter-in-place orders, and social distancing. The death toll from coronavirus could have reached 300,000. Pat yourselves on the back there. All you've done is destroy society and destroy the economy, but I guess you've got your models to keep you warm at night. So let us see what's happening in the chat. Hey, Matt Forney. I believe Matt Forney tweeted that the whole purpose of this shutdown is to immiserate people. Well, it seems to be certainly doing that. A blessed Good Friday to all, says Sam Jameson. Ricky Bullock, I wonder if he's listening. He's angry with me. I'm not angry with him. So I hope he comes back. COVID, is he talking about the China virus, says David Wright? Well, yes. It's called the COVID-19. It's called the coronavirus. It's called the Wuhan virus. It's called the Wu flu. It's called SARS-CoV-19, something like that. There's so many different names for this disease. David Wright says, so it's agreed when referring to Fauci, use the term il duce. Yes, I think that is a very good idea. Hey, great sound again. I don't know why. All I can say is, again, this is a very live room. And the room I was in previously was a dead room. Okay, so let's get back to it. What does Jim Kunstler have to say? Risings and Fallings is the title of his column today. In the corkscrewing anguish of the social sequester, with careers, savings, futures, and dreams whirling down the drain, voices rise above the din of conflicting statistics to ask, what is going on here? To some, it looks like a deliberate attempt to demolish what's left of the economy for political advantage. Clouds of suspicion gather over the two medical superstars of the daily briefing show, Drs. Fauci and Birx, as they somewhat sheepishly revise their numbers for contagion and death downward and attempt to balance the formula of model projections versus mitigation efforts. Was the stay-at-home panic necessary after all? Will it save the day or kill off modern life as we knew it? Well, every place else in the world was shutting down, weren't they? Did they all go off their rockers too? At least 100 doctors died in Italy, heroically tending the stricken, so they say. South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore opted for flat-out medical Gestapo action. Britain, Spain, France, and Germany about the same, but minus testing at the grand scale and tracing of contacts. Honestly, how is it possible the whole planet punked itself? I certainly don't know the answer to all this, although readers are twanging on me to declare the whole COVID-19 story a hoax, which I'm not ready to do. I do know this. America has become utterly intolerant of uncertainty. And in the absence of certainty, that age-old human cognitive skill called pattern recognition, which has made us such a successful species, kicks into high gear, scanning the field of view for answers. Any string of dots that affords even the slimmest plausibility goes on the table for review, including a lot of stories tagged as conspiracy theories. I know this too. The financial side of the gasping global economy was running off the rails well before COVID-19 flew out of its bat cave into somebody's soup bowl, or out of China's Wuhan virus lab, if that's how you like it, or before it seeped out of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's ark of world-saving secrets. In the US and Europe, finance had come to mostly eclipse every other human endeavor of wealth production, with the catch that finance actually didn't produce any real wealth. It only winkled and swindled wealth, or the mere ghosts of wealth, with its asset-stripping magic from the places where wealth once did truly dwell, or else ginded up abstruse rackets that attempted to replace the utility of money with sheer math. Or, when all else failed, it just resorted to plain old accounting fraud, until finally there was so much there not actually there that the whole holographic fantasy flickered out. The pre-Easter bear market rally on Wall Street has been a wonder, don't you think? As the numbers of able-bodied people out of work rocketed up past 10 million during the same period, the stock indexes shot up 3, 5, 6% a day. Say what? You're telling me that's based on the prospect of a magnificent earnings in the third quarter, with every business on God's green earth writhing in the dust like squashed bugs, and every supply line for basic goods and the gazillion spare parts for everything all choked off? And meanwhile, the American public sequesters and festers, waiting for those $1,200 checks that will fix everything. Let's face it, this is a twilight zone between stupor and fury. Nobody is paying anything to anyone. All obligations are suspended. Salaries, rents, mortgages, bills, loans, bets, and VIGs, all up in the air somewhere, but definitely not moving to their assigned destinations. The velocity of money is zero, and all the various new term facilities and structured vehicles conjured by the Federal Reserve and Congress amount to a mere shadow of money moving, even though they are represented by trillions of brand new alleged dollars. For every 10 points that the Standard & Poor's rose this week, somewhere down the line, as many hedge funders will be dribbled like so many basketballs to the hoop of judgment. The nation now has the long Easter weekend to stew and ruminate over its fate, with spring achingly vivid and beckoning beyond the grim streaked windows of sequestering. Those little cans of Easter spam with pineapple rings won't offer much consolation, combined with the abject discovery that even Netflix only has so many sequels to Frozen for children going catatonic with ennui. Kids are generally not so excited by stock and bond markets, but that's probably where the genuine melodrama picks up on Monday. The weeks ahead, there will give the phrase down to earth a whole new meaning. Oh, and there's a long piece in USA Today, and it's all Donald Trump's fault. Yeah, it's all Donald Trump's fault. Golf, handshakes, and Mar-a-Lago conga line. Squandered week highlights Trump of lack of COVID-19 focus. Wait a minute, aren't these the same people who were screaming bloody murder when Trump shut off travel from China? Aren't they the same people? Oh, let's see. March the 6th. Oh, we find out the annual music festival, South by Southwest, was canceled that day. You know something is serious when South by Southwest gets canceled. The hipsters, they love it. I mean, it's just, one can only imagine the misery that they were plunged into. Let's see, and just a day earlier, the chief of the World Health Organization had explicitly beseeched world leaders to prepare, warning that the epidemic can be pushed back, but only with a collective, coordinated, and comprehensive approach that engages the entire machinery of government. This is where I stopped reading the story, because the World Health Organization and its commie leader, who's not a physician, have been thoroughly disgraced by this. They have been proved to be aiding and abetting the propaganda efforts of the People's Republic of China, which lied about the disease, which withheld vital information, allowed a multitude of people, I believe 500,000, to leave Wuhan and spread the disease all over the world. And then the World Health Organization came out and said that stigmatization, xenophobia was the real problem, and that the COVID virus could not be communicated person to person. And we're still taking advice from those people. A long think piece from The Atlantic: the pandemic will cleave America in two. And there is, again, what these people didn't know, that there's a huge divide in America already between the haves and the have-nots. Viruses aren't picky. They tear through neighborhoods and nations, infecting whomever they can, and the new coronavirus is no exception. The pain of the present pandemic will be felt and is already being felt by just about everyone in the United States and all over the world in one way or another. After the pandemic has run its course, no one will be wholly untouched. At the same time, there will be stark disparities in how certain segments of the American population experience this crisis. Some of these disparities will be the result of luck or coincidence, a matter of where someone happened to travel, what line of work they chose, or what city they live in. But in a country that was highly unequal in so many ways, well before it had a confirmed case of COVID-19, other disparities will be sadly predictable, falling along racial and class lines, as well as other fateful divides. Again, we're all going to pretend that we didn't know that Black Americans have very high rates of obesity and morbid obesity, diabetes, hypertension, etc., etc. Let's just pretend that we didn't know that. So is the help, is the mitigation, the financial mitigation, is it working? Well, according to The Week, it is not. A federal disaster loan program offering up to $2 million in relief is now capping out at $15,000 and is leaving some borrowers wondering if they'll even get that. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, an offshoot of the Small Business Administration's emergency fund system, has faced an unprecedented number of requests amid the COVID-19 pandemic and is having trouble keeping up and following through with promised loans amounts, the New York Times reports. Several applicants reportedly said SBA representatives told them funding for the program was running out. Deb Woodshade, a chiropractic wellness business owner, told the Times she had been approved for a nearly $25,000 loan, but was given documents on Wednesday telling her that the loan had been cut to less than a third of that amount. As part of the $2 trillion relief bill signed by President Trump last month, applicants to the program were also supposed to be made eligible for a $10,000 advance in the form of a grant that would not have to be repaid, and the money was reportedly supposed to be distributed within 3 days of applying. According to the Times, that money has yet to be dispensed. I'm afraid I won't see a penny. Virginia Warnken-Kelsey, an opera singer who applied on March 29th, told the Times. The sudden onslaught of requests caused by the virus has handed the SBA a historic influx of loan applications, the Washington Post reports, leading to a major applicant backlog. The $10 billion in federal funding provided by the CARES Act would cover the $10,000 advances of about 1 million businesses. But in 3 days, the program reportedly received more than 3 million applicants. Well, I guess that's what happens when you decide to destroy the world's biggest economy. Never let a crisis go to waste. What does the Associated Press have for us. As Trump rails against mail voting, some allies embrace it. Gosh, I wonder who. President Donald Trump's claiming without evidence that expanding mail-in voting will increase voter fraud. Without evidence. But several GOP state officials are forging ahead to do just that, undermining one of Trump's arguments about how elections should be conducted amid the coronavirus outbreak. While Trump has complained that voting by mail is ripe for fraud, Republican state officials in Iowa, Ohio, and West Virginia have all taken steps to ease access to mail-in ballots following health officials' warnings that voting in person can risk transmission of the deadly virus. Yeah, don't go to the polling places. You'll die if you go to the polling places. This is I suppose, is a particularly novel argument for destroying free and fair elections. The Nebraska's Republican governor urged voters to apply for absentee ballots. Florida's GOP chairman says the party will continue to run a robust vote-by-mail program. What this tells me is the Republican establishment in Iowa, Ohio, West Virginia, Nebraska, and Florida, they're idiots. The disconnect between Trump and Republican state officials illustrates the abrupt hard turn the president and his national political allies have taken on the issue. Before the coronavirus hit, many in the GOP had warmed to mail-in voting because they're idiots, agreeing that it can be conducted without fraud and even used to their political advantage. But Trump's hard line appears to be driven by his personal suspicions and concerns about his own re-election prospects. Yes, massive voting fraud by the Democrats would not be good for Donald Trump's re-election prospects. Trump's comments put his Republican allies and states in the awkward position of trying to defend their practices without criticizing the president. It's disappointing when anyone in leadership makes fraud claims, said Kim Wyman, the Republican Secretary of State of Washington State, which has had universal mail voting since 2010, and there's not going to be very many Republicans left in Washington State soon. When it happens, the public loses confidence in the foundational pillar of our system. Now, it's been a commonplace. Republicans have talked about this for decades, that in a presidential election, they have to win by 2 to 3%, because otherwise there will be enough Democratic fraud such that the Democrats will win. This is something that is not kept secret. Republicans have been quoted saying this for decades. People are bused to the polls, people are invited to fish fries, vote early, vote often, as they say. Evidence of non-American citizens voting in elections. The Democrats are dead set against voter ID. And the claim is that, there's people who can't have ID because they're poor or whatever, or that black people have some problem with voter ID. Well, as I've noted before, if you do not have photo ID, you cannot get on an airplane. You cannot buy alcohol or tobacco, depending on your age. There's a whole host of things that one cannot do in the United States without photo ID. But yes, let's keep up the pretense that the Republicans want to eliminate fraud from elections because they're, wait for it, racist. I've long believed that insanity is a communicable disease, and living under the sanitary dictatorship has proved it to me. Jennifer Rubin, who is the conservative columnist at the Washington Post, she tweeted yesterday, "If Biden is serious about winning, he needs to accuse Trump of willingness to kill people." And this tweet is illustrated with a picture of a black woman wearing a red hood and with a stars and stripes bandana with a medical mask over top of it. Again, Jennifer Rubin, if Biden is serious about winning, he needs to accuse Trump of willingness to kill people. Sebastian Gorka commented, "This woman is sick." Carl Vincent responded, only two possibilities. Someone is paying Rubin for her outrageously twisted Twitter comments, or two, she really is a twisted, stupid cheerleader for the left and has been posing as a conservative for her entire career. Either one is as bad as it gets. Well, Jennifer Rubin is not a conservative. She is a neoconservative. And the neoconservatives, they're not conservative. They are revolutionaries. They are the spiritual descendants of Leon Trotsky. Oh, yes. Speaking about madness, let's go back to the Washington Post from Alexander Petri. No, this was 2 days ago. Sitting on a throne of skulls, Mitch McConnell confirms his 8,999th judge. Will Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, keep confirming judges in this time of pandemic? We will go back to judges, he said in an interview. My motto for the rest of the year is leave no vacancy behind. The whole landscape was barren and the fires burned everywhere. And in the smoldering remains of the Senate, Mitch McConnell sat on a throne of skulls, making preparations to confirm his 8,999th judge. Mitch McConnell would leave no vacancy behind. The people were long gone. The streets were empty, and some old scraps of burned newspaper tossed on the hot, sulfurous wind. And Mitch McConnell was still confirming judges. The sky was a dark, angry red. The sun was not visible and had not been visible for a long time. There were no longer any rhinoceroses whatsoever. What? There were exactly 3 birds. The halls of Congress were empty, except for John Quincy Adams' ghost and one hoarse buzzard perched on a cracked torso in Statuary Hall, and Mitch McConnell was still confirming judges. Just one more, he muttered. His voice echoed in the rows of bones all around him. He had been assiduously confirming judges for a very long time, although night and day were now the same and were difficult to measure. Clocks had ceased to exist. Just one more lifetime appointment. You see what the left and the media is doing here? They are luxuriating in disaster porn in an attempt, another coup attempt against Donald Trump. I mean, do these people watch The Living Dead, or they see that Cormac McCarthy movie, The Road, and they think, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. How can we bring that about? This woman is bonkers, completely bonkers, but the media, our political establishment, hates Donald Trump so much that he has driven them insane, absolutely insane. Let's see. Yes, the PJ Media, Tyler O'Neill commented, no, this isn't the Onion or the Babylon Bee. This is the Washington Post. Sure, this satire is in the opinion section, but it isn't clearly marked as satire, whereas the satire police its Snopes when you need them. Petrie's satirical prose aims to illustrate the absurdity of trying to get judges confirmed in the midst of a pandemic, but it only shows just how little she understands about the need for originalism. When judges can just willy-nilly reinterpret the Constitution to say whatever they wanted to say, they are effectively seizing unlimited power, the kind of power she seems to think that McConnell is after. Why shouldn't Mitch McConnell go about confirming judges? That's his job as Senate Majority Leader. Are they looking for a lockdown of Congress? Peter Hitchens was very irked today. Don't use this word lockdown. This is what happens in prisons. This is not what happens in free societies. But unfortunately, we no longer live in free societies. Yeah, let's see. Joe Biden still running for president, apparently. And he gives these talks. Over the internet, and he's absolutely incoherent. Someone, this is from Reddit, I think. Build second mock White House. Tell Biden he wins. Secret Service actually dementia nurses. Lives out 4 to 8 years thinking he is president. We can watch on TV. Well, that sounds pretty exciting. Don't you think? Meanwhile, if the media is correct about this, and they've never been wrong about anything, the Democrats want to drop Joe Biden for sexy Andrew Cuomo, poll finds. A majority of Democrats want to nominate New York Governor Andrew Cuomo for president instead of Joe Biden, according to poll results shared exclusively with the New York Post. The national poll found 56% of Democrats prefer Cuomo, with 44% wanting to stick with presumptive nominee Biden, a 12-point margin, well outside the 4.8 margin of error for the Democratic sample. Hispanic voters, young people, women, and self-identified liberals are most likely to favor dumping the former vice president for Cuomo. Note that Black people are not in that list, and it was Black voters in, I believe, South Carolina who rescued Biden's campaign. He was dead in the water, and all the Blacks went out to vote for Joe Biden, presumably because he was Barack Obama's vice president. I don't know. If the Democrats do dump Biden, will the Black voters turn out? Because it was a drop in the Black voter support that led to Hillary losing to Trump. That was one of the major reasons. Maybe they will, feel dissed, as the kids like to say. The poll, conducted April 3rd to 6th, was commissioned by the conservative Pro-Market Club for Growth, which generally supports Republican candidates. Cuomo denied last month that he wanted to run for president, but some Democrats still are clamoring for an alternative to Biden, who faded from public view during the coronavirus outbreak, which elevated Cuomo in daily press conferences. The Republicans, or the Trump campaign, put out a video ad yesterday, which is just devastating. It shows Joe Biden, the usual stuff of him not knowing what he's running for or where he is, but also talking about China, how much he loves China, that China, they're our great friends, our pals. And, Donald Trump is a very, very bad man for stopping traffic from China. And then apparently he forgot that he had said this, because they show footage of Joe Biden saying that he congratulated the president for stopping travel from China. And of course, there's the little matter of Biden's crackhead, incestuous son, Hunter Biden, who, of course, is deeply enmeshed financially with the communist regime. Oh, yes, COVID-19 has been racialized. As the coronavirus takes hold in Detroit, pandemic magnifies city's poverty, racial disparities. This is from 3 reporters at CNBC. Detroit's rapid growth as a new hotspot for the coronavirus outbreak in the U.S. underscores the city's racial and socioeconomic disparities. The city's challenges with poverty and lack of access to healthcare have made doctors' and nurses' jobs more complex as they treat patients, many of whom had serious health conditions before becoming infected with COVID-19. Black people make up about 14% of Michigan's population, but 33% of its coronavirus cases and 40% of all COVID-19 deaths. And again, I can't imagine why anyone would be surprised by this. The streets of downtown Detroit are desolate. Its factories are shuttered. A city that, for the first time in a lifetime, was showing strong signs of a resurgence has been brought to a standstill due to the coronavirus pandemic. While the Motor City is known for its toughness and grit, it also has widespread poverty, which makes it harder for many residents to get the health care and medications they need. Despite a thriving downtown for the first time in decades, yes, a little toy town for white people, Detroit's rapid rise as a nationally recognized hotspot for the pandemic has magnified the city's racial and socioeconomic inequities and made the jobs of doctors and nurses harder. Detroit has, you don't hear very much reporting about Detroit in the same way that you don't hear very much reporting from Baltimore, because this is just good for nobody, because people just recoil in horror, or they just refuse to believe how broken down Detroit and Baltimore have become. I already talked about the new report. Let's see. Oh, yes, Whitmer, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. She has this strange frozen face. Too much Botox, perhaps? According to the Detroit Free Press, after Friday, Michigan residents will no longer be able to jump in the car or cross the street to visit friends and relatives inside the state or go to the cottage up north, with limited exceptions. This is one of the major changes in Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-home order issued Thursday, which also extends the expiration of the order to May the 1st. Until now, travel between two Michigan residences has been permitted. Beginning Saturday morning, that will end, except for purposes such as caring for a relative, an elderly friend, or a pet, visiting a nursing home or similar facility, attending a funeral with no more than 10 people, or complying with a court order related to child custody. All public and private gatherings of any size are prohibited, Whitmer said. People can still leave the house for outdoor activities, and outdoor activities are still permitted as long as they're taking place outside of 6 feet from anyone else. So there's a boomlet for this frozen-faced woman to be Joe Biden's Veep pick. That sort of matriarchy that we're living under, and Big Mom is in control, and Big Mom doesn't want anyone having fun or society existing because somebody might get hurt. From Politico, the woman in Michigan goes national. Governor Gretchen Whitmer is dealing with a historic pandemic, a bullying president, and a big job tryout. She's the one who basically said that you can't do anything in the state of Michigan anymore, and Donald Trump is the bully. You get a picture of her here. She's wearing some sort of leather coat, butter-colored leather coat, ruby red lipstick. I don't know. There seems to be a lot of men now who want to be abused by women. They want to be told, how worthless they are. And I guess this would be a big part of Gretchen Whitmer's political demographic. What's happening in Boston? First, yes, the virus decides when we reopen, says Il Duce. Too early to relax the lockdown, despite glimmers of hope in New York. Is he seriously taking the position that America will not be allowed to reopen again until he gives his approval? This is from the Daily Mail. Boston suburb sets up one-way sidewalks to allow residents to practice social distancing, and police will hand out $100 fines to anyone who walks in the wrong direction. Police in the suburb of Beverly noticed locals brushing up against each other as they walked in opposite directions along busy Lothrop Street. Fearing that the residents might inadvertently be spreading COVID-19, authorities implemented one-way sidewalks. Residents must now walk against traffic, so they are never coming into contact with someone who's walking in the opposite direction. Failure to comply will result in a $100 fine, but police said residents have been receptive to the idea. There is a picture here of one of those mobile LED signs, and it says "Walk Against Traffic." And there's a picture of a poster. In order to prevent the spread of COVID-19, one-way foot traffic only on sidewalks, walk-facing traffic at all times. I wonder, where this will go, because apparently, Americans are not going to be voting in person anymore because of COVID-19. We're talking about an election which is in November. Perhaps all manner of things can be banned because, it's fighting COVID-19. And you don't want people to die, do you? No, I don't want people to die. So here's another humiliating restriction from Van Nuys, California. A pop-up food pantry in Southern California on Thursday drew so many people that the line of cars waiting for free groceries stretched about a mile, a haunting sign of how the coronavirus pandemic has hurt the working poor. Hundreds of other people, many wearing trash bags to shelter from the rain, arrived at the one-day grocery giveaway on foot, forming a blocks-long queue in Van Nuys in the central San Fernando Valley region of Los Angeles. Organizers said they have had enough groceries to hand out to more than 2,500 families, with each receiving a 36-pound box of rice, lentils, and other staples, as well as frozen chicken, oranges, and other foods. Well, I'm glad to see that they're giving away chickens. I've talked previously on how the elite seems determined that poor people or poorer people, not the 1%, that no meat, you're not going to be able to eat meat in the future. Vegan food is delicious and delivers just as much protein. Well, no, it doesn't. A great many vegans and vegetarians have to take protein supplements, but they've been pushing bugs on us. Oh, bugs are delicious. Yeah. And we can fake meat. Oh, we can fake it perfectly. And, maybe that will become the norm. That COVID-19 demands that no one is allowed to eat meat anymore. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the direction in which we are going. Oh, yes. I no longer need to look at my watch. Actually, I don't wear a watch or a clock or my smartphone around 7 o'clock because there is this abominable banging all throughout the city, which is helping people. How exactly? That people have been imprisoned in their homes and virtually ordered to celebrate their imprisonment. It's so sad. Again, from Associated Press, the howling, Americans let it out from depths of pandemic. It starts with a few people letting loose with some tentative yelps. Then neighbors emerge from their homes and join, forming a roiling chorus of howls and screams that pierces the twilight to end another day's monotonous forced isolation. From California to Colorado to Georgia and upstate New York, Americans are taking a moment each night at 8 p.m. to howl in a quickly spreading ritual that has become a wrenching response of our society cut off from one another by the coronavirus pandemic. They howl to thank the nation's healthcare workers and first responders for their selfless sacrifices. I thought that was at 7 o'clock. Much like the balcony applause and singing in Italy and Spain, others do it to reduce their pain, isolation, and frustration. Some have other reasons, such as to show support for the homeless. What? In Colorado, Governor Jared Polis has encouraged residents to participate. Children who miss their classmates and backyard dogs join in, their own yowls punctuated by the occasional fireworks, horn blowing, and bell ringing. There's something very Western about howling that's resonating in Colorado. The call and response aspect of it, most people try it and love to hear the howl in return, said Bruce Mayuro, a poet, storyteller, and activist who works at National Jewish Health. Millions of Americans howling on cue at 8 p.m. every evening? It sounds downright satanic to me. Now, you will recall that a few weeks ago, the naval officer, the captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, he leaked a letter complaining about the impossibility of following COVID-19 distancing rules on his ship. And he was cashiered for this. Oh, but, we can't. Apparently, that was too mean. Leaking information, top secret information about the combat readiness of a ship in the Pacific Ocean near China. I think this fellow is lucky that he wasn't executed. But according to Fox News, an internal investigation into a leaked letter that led to the commander of the Navy's USS Theodore Roosevelt being fired has concluded, and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Michael Gilday said Thursday that all options are on the table, and he is not ruling out reinstating Captain Brett Crozier to his position. Crozier was ousted last week after sounding the alarm about the need to offload sailors from the ship due to the COVID-19 outbreak. I'm taking no options off the table as I review that investigation, Gilday told reporters. I think that's my responsibility to approach it in a way that's with due diligence to make sure that it's completely fair and as unbiased as I can possibly make it. Gilday said Crozier's fate aboard the ship is wide open as far as I'm concerned. It's unclear when the Navy will make a decision about the findings of the investigation, but Gilday said that he is under no pressure from anybody in terms of my pace or in terms of any kind of influence. Nobody has talked to me about that investigation. Absolutely incredible. Oh, yes, and never let a crisis go to waste. You want to hear a fake news story? Well, here's something from Thomson Reuters. Calls billed to lift trans ban in U.S. military with coronavirus crisis. No, they're not. There's no such calls. I think they got a hold of some activists or some trans activists or some trans activists got a hold of someone from Thomson Reuters, and that's how we get this fake news. Nick Talbot put himself on the front line. All these military metaphors. Pathetic fallacy. On the front line of the new coronavirus pandemic, he got a job at his local Walmart in Ohio. His first choice was to enlist in the military, but as a transgender man, he was not allowed. Sunday marks the first anniversary of a ban on trans people joining the U.S. Armed Forces. But with most recruitment stations closed due to coronavirus lockdowns, calls are growing for President Donald Trump's policy to be reversed. I almost feel like a caged animal. I'm just kind of standing here on the sidelines, watching everything happen in front of me, Talbot, 26, told the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm capable, qualified, and willing to do more, but there's this barrier in front of me that makes absolutely no sense, said Talbot, who is a plaintiff in one of 4 lawsuits filed in federal courts challenging the bans. Let's see. A spokeswoman for the U.S. Department of Defense said in an email the department is not considering adjusting existing policy. Thousands of military personnel have been deployed to fight COVID-19, distributing medical supplies, cleaning nursing homes, and removing victims' bodies, with more than 16,000 U.S. deaths as of Thursday, the second highest in the world. But again, I'd just like to remind everybody that we now have confirmation that the Centers for Disease Control is telling doctors to ascribe the cause of death as COVID-19, even when people have not been tested for it. They're juking the stats. Let's see. So where are all these calls? Where are all these calls coming from? Oh, Lambda Legal, an Alphabet People Rights group, said the government should make reforms in the military and allow trans Americans to serve. The dangers of discrimination come into sharpest focus in all hands-on-deck moments like this, when we need every capable and talented person available, said Peter Wren, a lawyer with the organization. For Kaysen Bradley, 22, that's Kaycen, who is helping to train aspiring military recruits as he waits for the ban to be lifted, the restrictions do not make sense. There's a lot of skepticism about whether or not we're able to do it, but at the end of the day, I've surpassed most of the cisgender men that I train with. He said, using a term that describes someone whose gender identity matches their birth sex. You're able to do anything they're able to do, if not more. And you're holding back people. That means you're not really worried about the military at all or about safety and defense. Well, the United States government has been involved in a decades-long experiment to fully integrate women into the armed forces, and it has largely been a failure. Because women, with few exceptions, cannot meet the physical demands. And these transgender men, like the bearded fellow, Mr. Wren, well, I guess his cisgender is a woman. So he would be subject to the same physical restrictions as those who had not transitioned. So is China going to pay? Nigel Farage warns Chinese interests lining up for fire sale of UK businesses. This is from Breitbart. He says that Chinese interests are buying vast swathes of our strategic and manufacturing industries. What is happening right now is that Chinese companies and Chinese money are lining up for what they expect to be a fire sale of British businesses, mentioning that Germany has put into law protections for German companies against foreign takeover during the coronavirus crisis. He continued, I fear we're going to allow China in to buy up vast swaths of our strategic and manufacturing industries, and it just can't be allowed. The problem is the same mob that sold us out to Brussels are now happy to sell out our sovereignty once again to China, and this needs a bigger, higher level of debate. Last month, Chinese firm Jingyi Group bought out British Steel. Former Prime Minister David Cameron and former Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne allowed Chinese state-run companies to invest in British nuclear power plants. And of course, Boris Johnson is very big on Huawei, and being part of the 5G system. Farage said, for some reason, many of our civil servants, politicians, and big business figures seem to be in love with the despicable, barbarous regime who don't just murder thousands of their own people every year, but put hundreds of thousands in camps where they're being re-educated away from their faith to support the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a nice regime. We know they steal intellectual property, and we know they have designs to effectively become the global superpower to take over the world in their own way. The Brexit Party leader's remarks come as MPs have launched an emergency House of Commons inquiry into the possibility of Chinese companies stripping the assets of British firms caught up in the pandemic crisis, particularly the high-tech companies, which are fundamental to the U.S. economy. Led by Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat, the inquiry would look into how the Foreign Office could take an active role in blocking Chinese asset stripping. How is this? Why is this even under discussion? I guess they don't understand in Britain what sovereignty means. I saw poll numbers yesterday from the United States indicating that a very strong majority of Americans are not very happy with China right now. And I think we may well see a situation where the fifth columnists, the non-Chinese fifth columnists in our countries are exposed and punished. And that we will work to root out the undermining of our sovereignty by the PRC. But people like to grovel to China. This is from the South China Morning Post. Nature magazine apologizes for reports linking COVID-19 with China. How about that? British scientific journal Nature has apologized for associating COVID-19 with China in its reporting, saying that early coverage of the global health crisis by itself and other media had led to racist attacks on people of Asian descent around the world. In an article published Tuesday, the publication said that the World Health Organization's announcement on February 11th that the official name for the pneumonia-like virus would be COVID-19 had been an implicit reminder to those who had been erroneously associating the virus with Wuhan and with China in their news coverage, including Nature. That we did so was an error on our part for which we take responsibility and apologize. It's clear that since the outbreak was first reported, people of Asian descent around the world have been subjected to racist attacks with untold human costs, for example, on their health and livelihoods. What are the untold human costs of this disease which came from China that the Chinese lied about and allowed to spread all over the world? What about those untold human costs? The article said that while it had been common for viral diseases to be associated with the areas in which outbreaks had occurred, like Middle East respiratory syndrome and the Zika virus, which was named after a Ugandan forest, the WHO had introduced guidelines in 2015 to reduce the negative impact of such labeling on people from those areas. Oh, so again, we're taking advice from the WHO, which is as corrupt as hell and in China's pocket. The impact of a stigmatized virus name would have worrying implications for students from China and other countries in Asia, hurting the diversity of university campuses and diversity of points of view in academia. Yeah, lots of political diversity coming from China, lots and lots and lots. We can see that in places like Vancouver, where protesters against what was going on, the crackdown in Hong Kong, were physically menaced by Chinese people and had their posters torn down. Beijing has strongly objected to any links between COVID-19 and China, saying that the origin of the coronavirus remains unknown and that establishing where it came from should be left to the scientific community and not be used as a political football. U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly used the term China virus in relation to the health crisis before dropping it last month after acknowledging there had been a rise in nasty language directed at the Asian American community. Brazilian lawmaker Eduardo Bolsonaro, son of the country's president, has said that the coronavirus was China's fault. So Beijing is saying you can't tell the truth. You can't tell the truth in China, but you can't tell the truth anywhere in the world because we say so. We're gonna let them get away with that. Another story from Breitbart. America should coordinate with allies to seize China's holdings of U.S. Treasury and other state treasuries' obligations as compensation for the one-party state's negligence regarding the coronavirus outbreak, said Gordon Chang, Daily Beast columnist and author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War. I think the United States should seize China's holdings of U.S. treasuries, he said on a Sirius XM show with Alex Marlowe. We should do this in conjunction with the issuers of the other major occurrences, said Chang, specifying China, the UK, Switzerland, and Japan. If we act alone, China is going to say that we repudiated our debt. We're going to take a reputational hit, which is going to be a big one. And they're going to say that we are an irresponsible member of the global financial system and that the US dollar shouldn't be the reserve currency of the world. If we act with our allies and friends, the issuers of these other currencies, we can take away that argument from China. We can never take enough money from China to compensate us. We've lost so many people. We will lose so many people. Even just if you looked at the financial damages, China doesn't have enough assets in the world to compensate the United States, much less other countries. Nevertheless, we've got to deter bad actors, including China, from doing what they did in spreading this disease. All we have to do is have the Treasury Department and the President of the United States say, we're not paying you back. We're confiscating your holdings of treasuries. Washington's seizure of China's U.S. Treasury holdings would be coordinated with parallel measures from Ottawa, London, Brussels, Bern, and Tokyo. Sounds like a good idea to me. Chang said, what the media has done in the United States is adopt China's narratives without fully explaining them. That is a dereliction of their duty. Chang maintained his call for decoupling the U.S. economy from China. I think we can cut our relations with China, not in decades, but in months, especially if President Trump is reelected. Of all the people who are running, Trump is the one who is most skeptical of China. He's the one who has actually changed America's China policy and broken the engagement approach of the last 4 decades. Again, an excellent idea. So what's happening in Britain, where they have, 2 prime ministers now? I see Britain is taking the same line as Justin Trudeau in Canada, Princess Rockstar. According to the Daily Mail, UK will have to live with some restrictions until coronavirus vaccine is developed. Say officials, as new survey reveals that 9 out of 10 Britons are observing stay-home advice after 980 daily death toll. Normal life will stay on hold until a vaccine becomes available in about 18 months. They keep this locked down for 18 months or anything close to 18 months, maybe as few as 2 or 3 months. There isn't going to be a Britain anymore. People are going to start attacking cops in the street. Tim Newman highlighted a video of a police officer, a woman, and she is instructing a family that they are not allowed to go out into the garden of their house. The lawn, as Americans would say. Silky Carlo tweets, insane. First, this policing defies minimal expectations of common sense. Second, the nation is under house arrest. We're restricted to our homes, including gardens, obviously, and this is crystal clear in the regulations. Tim Newman comments, this looks like the video of a deranged crackhead who's stolen a police uniform. Fraser Nelson writes in the Telegraph about Boris Johnson. Let's see. At the end of last week, the Prime Minister was beginning to wonder if the country was taking his advice too much to heart. He asked us to stay at home, and we have. At each daily press conference, medical and scientific advisors talk about the plunge in the use of transport and how well rules are being observed. What they don't say is that that was not quite in the original plan. Government modelers didn't expect such obedience. They expected workers to carry on and at least 1 million pupils to be left in school by parents. Well, that's not what happened. I guess there's been some resistance. Britain, some brave people sunbathing, brave people walking lonely trails. The deaths by COVID-19 are shocking, but so too are the effects of the lockdown. Our message, we are supposed to be keep working, but from home if possible, says one minister, but that message has got lost. The Treasury expected 3 million claimants for its job retention scheme. 9 million are now expected. The plan was for about 1 in 5 school pupils to stay in class, not just the children of key workers, but those regarded as vulnerable or with special needs. Instead, it seems just 2% of pupils turned up. This was troubling Boris Johnson during his initial COVID self-confinement. He'd started to discuss this with colleagues. Had they overdone the message? The stay-at-home exhortations were issued with such vigor because it was assumed, wrongly, that Brits would not really listen. Instead, we've become as obedient as Swedes, while the Swedes, in their collective refusal to lock down, are behaving like Brits. But it's hard to soften the lockdown message with the Prime Minister, the main messenger, out of intensive care, but until he fully recovers, out of action. Other options are now being discussed, perhaps adverts, politely telling us that our country needs us to work. As one minister puts it, somebody has to pay for the NHS. Parents, too, might be urged to send their children to school after Easter if they qualify. But it's easy to see how employers, workers, and parents have gone to ground. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. A message honed by Isaac Levito, the Tory election campaign chief, has worked all too well. Matt Hancock, the health secretary, has been working with the Prime Minister on the next step, how to stop the end of lockdown, that word again, being seen as a question of lives versus money. As a former economic advisor, Hancock is certainly mindful of the money. A $200 billion deficit could mean another decade of austerity. But other figures, infections, mortality rates, and deaths are rightly holding the national attention. Phasing out the lockdown needs to be spoken about in terms of lives versus lives, or crudely, whether lockdown might end up costing more lives than the virus. Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, has worried about this from the offset. In meetings, he often stresses that a pandemic kills people directly and indirectly. A smaller economy means a poorer society and less money for the NHS, eventually. But right now, he says, there will be parents avoiding the NHS, not vaccinating their children, so old diseases return. People who feel a lump now may not get it checked out. Cancer treatment is curtailed. Therapy is abandoned. Work is being done to add it all up and produce a figure for avoidable deaths that could in the long term be caused by lockdown. I'm told the early attempts have produced a figure of 150,000, far greater than those expected to die of COVID. This is, of course, a model, just like the model for COVID deaths produced by Imperial College. But estimates of lockdown victims are being shared among those in government who worry about the social damage now underway, the domestic violence, the depression, even suicides accompanying the mass bankruptcies. But these are deaths that may or may not show up in national figures in a year's time. It's hard to weigh them against a virus whose victims are being counted every day. The cabinet now is split into 3 groups. Some think still the lockdown is, if anything, too lax. One minister has even proposed adopting a French-style system demanding that no one steps outside without papers, authorizing them to do so. You know, that's funny because this was a British cliche for decades. You know, mocking the Soviet Union, mocking the Warsaw Pact countries, you know, mocking the Nazis. Papers, please. Where are your papers? And now, apparently, the British cabinet, or a large section of it, thinks that, yeah, it'd be a good idea to move to that system. Then we have those who think the cure is already worse than the disease and want to phase out lockdown at the earliest opportunity. Then a third group that think it doesn't matter what government thinks. Dominic Raab is in no place to settle these disputes. When he chairs meetings, he stresses that as First Secretary of State, he's just there to facilitate discussion and carry out the boss's instructions. When he arrives in number 10, he is guided by the Prime Minister's officials rather than his own. When asked, he says that Britain has a cabinet system of government with each minister running their own department. In theory, this is true. But in practice, the government was designed as the Boris show. The Treasury and the Cabinet Office have been fused with number 10 to create a triangle of power under his control. Sajid Javid resigned as Chancellor in protest at all this. And regarding it as a dangerous power grab, what he said at the time if number 10 aired. The question no one really asked was what would happen if this command and control Napoleonic model were to suddenly lose its Napoleon. Well, you see, yes, Britain is supposed to have cabinet government. Canada is supposed to have a cabinet government. Everywhere in the world, they've moved to what political scientists call der Führerprinzip, the Führer principle, the leader principle. That I suppose Tony Blair was the first big exponent of this, that cabinet ministers were nobodies, that he was the man in charge. He was the man who had been elected prime minister. Well, no, that's not how the parliamentary system works. But Tony Blair hated the parliamentary system. The prime minister in a parliamentary country is supposed to be primus inter pares, that is to say, first among equals. That these politicians like to say, oh, I received X millions of votes in the last election. No, you didn't. You most likely received tens of thousands of votes because no one elected Tony Blair president of Britain in the same way that no one elected Stephen Harper or Justin Trudeau president of Canada. But that's the way that they carry on, and we've allowed them to get away with it. So what else do we have from Britain? Now, I have to say something about Britain that, well, particularly England, the decline of England, say, since 1945 is absolutely shocking. And you now have this docile population which is prepared to put up with martial law because of mathematical models. Well, I suppose in retrospect, it's not really that surprising, because England has harbored just a vast hunger for decadence for decades now. That we make jokes about, oh, mate, you got license for that. But it's not really all that funny, I would not surprised. If there's going to be turmoil, revolution, dissolution in any Western country, I think that Britain is likely to be the first. I think it's likely to be the first because there's just been a collapse of order. Some good news, scientists say many more people than previously thought could have acquired coronavirus immunity after discovering 15% of people in the city dubbed the German Wuhan could be carrying antibodies. But wait a minute, Nature magazine has told us that this disease has nothing to do with Wuhan or China, that it's unknown where it came from. Scientists studying Gangelt, this is from the Daily Mail, the town at the center of Germany's first big outbreak, found as many as 15% of people may have already been infected with the virus and acquired immunity. They said yesterday that they had found antibodies to the virus in people who had shown no symptoms of coronavirus, boosting hopes the spread is slowing. If 15% of people do have antibodies, Germany's actual death rate could be as low as 0.37%, 5 times lower than the current level. And of course, yes, death rate of 0.37%, which responds pretty well to traditional winter-spring flu deaths. But for some reason, this was different. And the world had to be locked down. Society had to be destroyed. Who decided this and why? Will we ever know? Okay. In Australia, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said there is no map for where Australia finds itself, and the virus restrictions will not lift for some time. I suppose it's a very good opportunity for China to buy up even more of Australia than they already own. There are 5,919 confirmed COVID cases in Australia. Are you kidding me? There are fewer than 6,000 cases. The national death toll stands at 48. 48! Yeah, that definitely seems like justification for going nuts and wrecking everything, doesn't it? Today, of course, is a Good Friday, and it is the strangest Good Friday in the history of the Christian religion because the shepherds have deserted their flocks. According to AP, on the day set aside to mark Christ's crucifixion, most churches stood empty. Streets normally filled with emotional processions were silent. St. Peter's Square was almost deserted, and many religious sites in the Holy Land were closed. Instead, Christians around the world commemorated Good Friday behind closed doors, seeking solace in online services and trying to uphold centuries-old traditions in a world locked down by the coronavirus pandemic. Inside Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the chanting of a small group of clerics echoed faintly through the heavy wooden doors as a few people stopped and kneeled outside to pray. In St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis presided over a candlelit procession with nurses and doctors among those holding a torch. In a few minutes, I'm going to be discussing Evelyn Waugh's biography of St. Edmund Campion. And this will remind us of let's say, a hardier, more manly era when Christians willingly went to their death in order to bring the Eucharist to people. So, how are the celebrities taking all this? I don't know. It's been pretty bad for the celebrities. Apparently, they've been stuck in their 10,000 square foot mansions, on their 30,000 square foot property. It's tough. But apparently Naomi Campbell is stepping up. She's this deeply sinister woman. And I guess she's looking there's some bombshells related to her, which are in her future. But I guess she's looking to get ahead of the story, as they say. This is from the New York Post. Naomi Campbell is in her underwear. The supermodel isn't shy about telling me just that when the first question I ask her over the phone is, "What are you wearing?" This is a man wrote this story, Chuck Arnold. You should be ashamed of yourself. Right now, I'm wearing a white Azadine Alala shirt, Campbell tells the Post, as she's about to change into her workout gear. On the bottom, I'm just in my underwear. With only Zoom and other video conferencing calls to worry about during the stay-at-home lockdown, Campbell now only dresses from the waist up sometimes. But that face is still fierce and flawless in her new daily YouTube series, No Filter with Naomi, which premiered Monday. The show features Campbell chatting with guests such as Cindy Crawford, Mark Jacobs, and Nicole Richie from her home to theirs. As she nears turning 50 next month, Campbell has been having a moment. In addition to No Filter, a limited-run series, she is a judge and producer on Amazon Prime's new show, Making the Cut, a fashion design competition. And before we went into full coronavirus crisis mode with masks and gloves, Campbell had become the poster girl for germaphobes everywhere, thanks to a viral YouTube video posted last July, which shows her extreme disinfecting routine on airplanes. Yeah, we're taking advice now from superannuated runway models. And how about Prince Harry and Meghan Mertz? Well, they have a new organization. They were formerly Sussex Royal, and they were told by Queen Elizabeth to stop doing that. And so they have a new organization, and it's DOA. After formerly being known as Sussex Royal, the couple are now moving on to light without royal family backing, which includes a new moniker for their charity organization. It was announced by The Telegraph this week that the former Sussex couple has applied to trademark many items under the name Archewell, including paperclips. The name is said to come from ancient Greek origins. However, many have had a tough time knowing exactly how to pronounce it. Some have questioned whether to say Archewell, Archewell, or Arkewell. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry are yet to confirm how the name is spoken. Instead, they are focusing on remaining safe during the current pandemic. I guess that's why, they were living on Vancouver Island, secluded at the north end of the island in isolation. And so they decided to move to Los Angeles and expose themselves to planes and airports and all that. That was really concentrating on remaining safe. The couple told The Telegraph, like you, our focus is on supporting efforts to tackle the global COVID-19 pandemic. But faced with this information coming to light, we felt compelled to share the story of how this came to be. Meghan and Harry then proceeded to explain to the newspaper where the name originated from. Before Sussex Royal came the idea of arch, the Greek word meaning source of action. We connected to this concept for the charitable organization we hope to build one day, and it became the inspiration for our son's name. Seriously, you expect anyone to believe that? There's a perfectly good English name called Archibald. They didn't name their kid Archibald, assuming that it is their kid, and we have no reason to assume that. They called him Archie. Like the ginger in the comics and in that show, Riverdale. Archwell is a name that combines an ancient word for strength and action and another that evokes the deep resources we each must draw upon. We look forward to launching Archwell when the time is right. How long are we before, Harry and Meghan? Who? Come on, Harry and Meghan. I don't know who you're talking about. Everyone knows them. No, I don't think everyone knows them. Are they royals? Well, kind of. No, what does that mean? Kind of. Well, they're non-active royals. I don't know what that means. I have no idea what that could possibly mean. Let's go back to the chat. Lamprey Milt says baby boomers have fueled the overpriced real estate market. Only people willing to pay $750K and up for a home in New York is Chinese natives. A spiritual mamzer says public transport is a nightmare. We need cars, bicycles, and e-bike to go to work. Quachalango says, I think transporting two people in a truck bed is also safe. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Ashley Bravo, who had yesterday's comment of the day, as I highlighted on Twitter, says, how come Christianity became a thing in South Korea? I even heard that there are almost as many Christians in China as there are people in the USA. Is this true? Well, Christianity was in China before Buddhism was. It's been in China a long time. Adam says, Kim Iverson pointed out today that, yeah, I talked about that death rate of 0.37% in Germany. My money is on France, said Lamprey Milt. Oh, to fall apart? Yeah, I suppose that's a possibility as well. Ashley Bravo says, is fentanyl the new reverse opium war? It could be seen as that way in retaliation for the century of shame, as the Chinese call it. Half Galician says, Archwell sounds like an HMO. Yeah, it's one of those names that doesn't mean anything. And increasingly companies that used to be called, Canadian Power Corporation, they have this name. And you're supposed to, not say it. You're supposed to whisper it, Archwell. Ooh. Yeah, so many of these companies have been renamed. And, the name provides no information about what this company does. Okay, let's see. I want to talk about Victoria now. I'm living in the Victoria Harbor region temporarily in a hotel. I was talking to the night clerk last night, and he told me that there are 8 guests in the hotel. The hotel has 71 rooms, and there are 8 guests. It is truly surreal. Walk in the into the hotel lobby or out. Where's everybody? Where's all the people? There's no one in the parking lot. There's no one on the streets. It's absolutely bizarre. Since the normal people have left the streets downtown, they are dominated even more than normal by the deranged. Just before 7 o'clock last night, I was at the corner of Douglas and Yates, and I'm not making this up. This is what I saw. I saw a man, I guess him to be, I don't know, in his 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell, and I'll explain why. He was wearing dark green pants. He was wearing a lime green t-shirt underneath a lime green open shirt. He had a bear pelt as a cape, and his head was covered with a black hood, like an executioner's hood. So, Johnson Street, downtown, has been dodgy for quite a few years. There is a place which serves people called Our Place, and it's become kind of a community with people hanging out there all day long. And they're at night as well, even when Our Place is closed. I discovered a few days ago that Victoria now has a tent city on Johnson Street, and it runs 4 blocks. So at a stroke, Victoria has descended into the madness that we've seen, say, in Los Angeles. Let's see. Frontline volunteers bring hand washing stations to Pandora, Tent City, and beyond. It's an absolute nightmare. An absolute nightmare. I mean, okay, so the tents are there. Are they ever going to come down? All businesses and even a church, a Baptist church, have put heavy iron gates in front of their properties to protect them from the homeless transient people. And it's going to radiate. You throw a stone in a pool, watch the waves radiate. That downtown Victoria has been dodgy for quite some time. I mean, it was dodgy before I got here in 2001. In fact, Celeste McGovern, who I mentioned yesterday, she wrote a cover story for my magazine on what had happened to Victoria. But now it's going to get much, much worse and much faster. What's the current situation in Canada? Well, we have 22,133 confirmed cases and 569 deaths. Again, the population of Canada is 38 million. In my province of British Columbia, there are 1,410 cases and 55 deaths. And again, there are 5.1 million people in British Columbia. And let's see, BC has 40 new COVID-19 cases, 5 additional deaths. And let's see, oh yes, I live on Vancouver Island. There are 84 cases of COVID-19 on Vancouver Island and 2 deaths, and everything has been shut. The economy has been wrecked, and society has been dissolved. I mean, that seems proportionate, wouldn't you say? Okay. It looks worldwide COVID-19 death toll tops 100,000, according to CBC. We're having a debate in Canada about what's called the Emergencies Act, which is essentially the federal government putting the country under martial law. And Prime Minister Trudeau has been talking about this with the premiers, and they do not like the idea. And one of the things that could happen is that Quebec does not have very many respirators, and then Trudeau would be in a position to take them from Alberta, which has many more, and give them to Quebec. And Canada is run for the benefit of Quebec. So one could expect that to happen. But let's see, government documents reveal a slow start to Canada's COVID-19 response. Briefing notes prepared by bureaucrats for federal ministers show just how quickly the COVID-19 situation evolved in Canada, with public health officials stating the risk of transmission in Canada was low right up until early March, only to recommend an ordered shutdown of economic life in this country some 2 weeks later. That's a typical liberal response, which is just to ignore the problem, ignore the problem, ignore the problem, and then totally overreact. Liberals always do this. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau warned Thursday that it could be as long as a year before normal life returns in Canada. Well, if that's true, there won't be a Canada. A dramatic change in messaging, considering how Public Health Agency of Canada officials were advising policymakers less than 2 months ago that COVID-19 risks were low in this country, and that mandatory quarantines for returning travelers would be too difficult to enforce. A March 10th department-drafted briefing note prepared for Health Minister Patty Hajdu, and that's always comforting when your health minister is called Patty. Well, not Patricia, not even Pat, but Patty. Ahead of question period said that with just 12 cases being reported nationwide at that point, the risk of spread of this virus within Canada remains low at this time. The note also said that the public health system is well equipped to contain cases coming from abroad, limiting the spread in Canada. They took no action to prevent infected people from coming to Canada. Zero. Nothing. As documents show, as early as January 28th, the World Health Organization was describing the risk of COVID-19 transmission as very high in China and high at the global level. The tranche of documents prepared by various government departments include many of the early planning memos that informed the federal government's response to COVID-19. They show that while the government was seized with repatriating Canadians from China's Hubei province and various cruise ships during that time, there was little talk of a possible pandemic. Public health officials questioned the accuracy of media reports out of the city of Wuhan in Hubei, suggesting that the virus was spreading through person-to-person contact. Based on the latest information that we have, there's no clear evidence that the virus is easily transmitted between people, a January 19th briefing note prepared for Hash2 said. This comes from the World Health Organization. They are responsible for publicizing that canard. And how many people have died as a result? Trudeau, well, hang on, let's see. Trudeau has, apparently he's leaving the Princess Bunker. That he was going to be there for 2 weeks. And then yesterday was 4 weeks. It's like Punxsutawney Phil. I guess he's just looking for his shadow. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau used his daily COVID-19 address to highlight the now launched Canada Emergency Business Account Program and announced that his remarks on Saturday will come from the floor of the House of Commons as it convenes to pass additional aid measures. After delivering 26 consecutive daily addresses from his front door, this will be a change in his schedule as he takes Sunday and Monday off. So for 4 weeks now, Trudeau has been coming out of the Princess Bunker and making a banal statement and then taking a softball question, say, from the media, and then going back in. And this has been so grueling, apparently, that he needs the weekend off. So apparently he is going to reunite with his wife and the kiddies. And Quebec Premier doesn't rule out schools' daycares opening ahead of May 4th. Well, that is very good news indeed. Premier François Legault made the comment Friday during a daily briefing by Quebec authorities on the COVID-19 epidemic in the province, noting promising results in the past few days are fueling some optimism, but stressing that nothing is etched in stone. Schools and daycares currently are slated to be closed until May the 4th. As soon as it will reach the peak and start to decrease the number of cases and the number of people in our hospitals, we'll be able to relaunch the economy, he said. I don't want to take any risk that is too high, but at the same time, we need eventually to restart the economy and give hope to the population. There's a good piece in the Financial Post by Joe Oliver, who was once, a few years ago, Canada's finance minister. He writes, the Prime Minister keeps reassuring Canadians he relies on the advice of experts in confronting the health crisis caused by COVID-19. Good. We need experts. But experts do not know everything, including in the current crisis, how many people have been infected. Experts can change their minds, as they have done on whether to wear a mask, for instance. And experts, scientists, and physicians cannot make the important judgments about priorities that public policy necessarily involves. An example of what can go terribly wrong when a politician abdicates decision-making to experts was the refusal early on to ban international airplane travel, thus helping spread the coronavirus around the world. The government clearly adopted that suspect medical recommendation because it conformed to its own ideological predilections. It never made any sense to allow visitors from virus hotspots to come to Canada, and when they did arrive, not to immediately quarantine them. The predictable result was to accelerate the contagion and make it harder and more painful to flatten the curve. Yet we repeatedly heard from the World Health Organization, Canada's chief public health officer, and the Minister of Health herself, that it was useless to keep foreigners out and might even be dangerous. The real reason for that mistaken advice was dread of being labeled racist and fear of offending the Chinese Communist Party. And so one last thing about Canada. So again, it appears that COVID-19, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, that it's been a bit of a damp squib compared to the we're all going to die predictions coming from the modelers. And so people are asking the question, what's really going on here? Why is something which is really not all that different in terms of its public health effects than seasonal flu? Why has this been used as an excuse to dissolve society and destroy the economy? Well, Someone called Marc-André Argentino, who is a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal, has determined that free speech must be eliminated too. QAnon conspiracy theories about the coronavirus pandemic are a public health threat. Yeah, this is the new lie. Racism, such like they're public health questions. And he talks about, let's see, QAnon conspiracy theories believe a deep state cabal of global elites is responsible for all the evil in the world. They also believe those same elites are seeking to bring down Trump, whom they see as the world's only hope to defeat the deep state. QAnon has now brought the same conspiracy mentality to the coronavirus crisis. Okay, the elite hates Donald Trump with a passion. They tried to destroy his election campaign by spying on it. And then they made a coup attempt that ran for years. Russia was the puppet master, and Trump was the puppet. That Trump was guilty of treason, no less, and this was going to be proved with the Mueller report. And Mueller report was a damn squib. And so we get an indictment, an impeachment from the House of Representatives. Okay, where's all the Russia stuff in it? There's nothing about Russia in it. It's about the Ukraine. So people like this, again, pretend that there is no such thing as an elite and that this elite doesn't hate Donald Trump. Let's see. The FBI once called conspiracy theories spread by QAnon and others a potential domestic terrorism threat. Yes, the FBI is in particularly good odor these days. They did such a bang-up job, trying to destroy Donald Trump's campaign and then attempting to lie their way out of it afterward. I'll just go briefly to the chat, and then I'm going to move on to the book club. Ashley Bravo says, who elected Bill Gates to be the medical czar? No one, but he does have tens of millions of dollars. You literally need a whole slew of antiviruses on Windows if you're downloading a bunch of shady links on shady sites. Okay. Adam says, I kind of felt like getting Chinese food the other day, but, I don't want it that badly. I don't think that Chinese restaurants are going to do very well at all after this is all over. I really don't think they're going to recover. Dawn from Beyond says, most Chinese restaurants in my area are closed, like China Kitchen and China King. Red Bull Asian Cuisine still has takeout. I know because of my DoorDash job, but personally, I prepare all my own food. Ed Dutton has been shilling for Islamism pretty hard lately, says Ashley Bravo. Really? That's quite disappointing. Doesn't he live in Finland? I wouldn't think there'd be a lot of support for that there. Okay. Let's go to the book club. The book today is from 1935 rather. It is by Evelyn Waugh, and it is called Edmund Campion, Jesuit and Martyr. I discussed Evelyn Waugh previously on the book club. I talked about his novel from the 1930s called Scoop, which is the best novel ever written about journalism. It is exceedingly funny as well. So Waugh is famed for his novels. But he wrote travel works. I mean, it's quite amazing, the traveling that he did in the 1930s and 40s, places like the Congo, British Guiana, places where people would be afraid to go. He was fearless in that respect. He wrote monographs, not just novels and travel works. One of the first books that he did was Rossetti, His Life and Works, the painter, which was published in 1928 by Duckworth. Duckworth had the opportunity to publish Decline and Fall, his first novel, but they refused the manuscript, supposedly for smut. Let's see. And he did a life of the Right Reverend Ronald Knox, his friend, Monsignor Ronald Knox, the English polymath in 1959. And he also wrote a small book on the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. So I want to give some background before I move into the story of the crisis in religion in Elizabethan England. The crisis began with Henry VIII. Actually, it began with Henry VIII's brother, Arthur. Arthur was the elder brother and would have expected to accede to the throne after their father's death. Arthur married a Spanish woman, Catherine of Aragon. Arthur died. Henry wanted to marry Catherine of Aragon, but this, under canon law, was considered to be incest. So he had to get permission from the Pope, which was granted. Catherine of Aragon proved unable to provide a male heir. And in 1533, Henry had the marriage annulled. Henry he claimed that the marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid because the permission that he was granted should not have been granted. Well, the Pope wasn't having that, and Sir Thomas More was not having that either. And Henry decided that he was going to displace the Catholic Church in England. There had been a rather tripartite system of power sharing in England in medieval times. You had the monarchy, which was powerful. You had the aristocracy, which was powerful. And you had the church, which was also powerful. But there was no particular domination of the country by any one of these entities. Henry decided that that was going to change. That what he did was he turned England into a dictatorship, a theocratic dictatorship. That Catholicism was effectively banned in England, and that more than that, everyone was required to declare an oath of his supremacy, of Henry's supremacy, as the head of this new Church of England. And Catholics were required to attend Protestant religious ceremonies. Now, I should point out that the Anglican Church has long been associated with what they call smells and bells, but this is really only since the Oxford movement of the 1840s. The Anglican Church was a very low church before that, and it certainly was in the 16th century. But Henry, he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, which he did, and he executed her 3 years later. Then there was Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, who was executed 2 years after marriage, and then Catherine Parr. And there's a succession crisis, and I guess the crisis lasted even after Queen Elizabeth. That Edward VI lived a short life from 1537 to 1553. He was Henry's son with Jane Seymour. And there was a problem with his legitimacy as well, because he was, by traditional law, illegitimate, as was his half-sister, Elizabeth. And there was an interregnum of 5 years when Queen Mary was on the throne, and Catholicism once again became the state religion of England. There was a great deal of uncertainty about Elizabeth when she took the throne in 1558, about how she would decide her religion and England's religion. Well, she chose Protestantism. And what we see during her reign is a crackdown on Catholics, which becomes more and more savage. It's long been amusing to me. I remember seeing this in a British Transport documentary, talking about Elizabeth's age, and just that England was absent from, the kind of violence that one saw on the continent. Well, as I say, England banned the religion, the Catholic religion, and of course, England had been Christian since the time of St. Augustine, that is to say, the English St. Augustine. And so priests were hunted down, tortured, and killed after kangaroo courts. And great Catholic families were reduced to penury because they refused to give up their religion. Now, Waugh begins his book with a wonderful set piece about the death of Queen Elizabeth. In the March of 1603, it was clear to everyone that Queen Elizabeth was dying. Her doctors were unable to diagnose the illness. She had little fever, but was constantly thirsty, restless, and morose. She refused to take medicine, refused to eat, refused to go to bed. She sat on the floor, propped up with cushions, sleepless and silent, her eyes constantly open, fixed on the ground, oblivious to the coming and going of her counselors and attendants. She had done nothing to recognize her successor. She had made no provision for the disposal of her personal property, of the vast heterogeneous accumulation of a lifetime, in which presents had come to her daily from all parts of the world, closets and cupboards stacked high with jewelry, coin, bric-a-brac, the wardrobe of 2,000 outmoded dresses. There was always company in the little withdrawing room waiting for her to speak, but she sighed and sipped and kept her silence. She had round her neck a piece of gold the size of an angel, engraved with characters. It had been left to her lately by a wise woman who had died in Wales at the age of 120. Sir John Stanhope had assured her that so long as she wore this talisman, she could not die. There was no need yet for doctors or lawyers or statesmen or clergy. Lord Admiral Howard was one of her visitors. He knelt beside her and with tears implored her to take a little nourishment. They brought a bowl of broth, and the Admiral coaxed her to take a spoonful or two from his own hands. But when he urged her to go to bed, she refused angrily, breaking into a confused and violent tale of her nightmares. "If you were in the habit of seeing such things in your bed as I do in mine," she said, "you would not persuade me to go there." But she had not the strength to sustain her rage, and when Cecil and the lawyers had left her, she shook her head piteously, saying, "My lord, I am tied with a chain of iron around my neck." The Admiral reminded her of her wonted courage, but she replied, desponding, I am tied, and the case is altered with me." The council sent the Archbishop of Canterbury to her. He came with several other divines, eloquent, circumspect men who had made a great career in her church to offer the consolations of religion, but their appearance roused her to fury. She rated them and sent them packing, crying that she was no atheist, but she knew full well that they were but hedge priests. The women about her tried to attribute causes to her melancholy. It was due to the execution of Essex, the execution of Mary of Scotland, the pardon of Tyrone. She herself confided to Lady Scrope that before the court moved from Whitehall, she had seen a hideous version of her own body, exceeding lean and fearful in a light of fire. She had asked, too, for a true looking-glass, which she had not seen for 20 years, and it was brought, fell exclaiming at all the flatterers that had so much commended her. All her life she had been surrounded by plots to implicate her in Wyatt's rebellion, plots against her life, to murder her with fireballs, to poison the pommel of her saddle, many of them real enough, some fomented by agents provocateurs, some the inventions of forgers and informers, plots that had no existence except in the brains of Walsingham and the Cecils. Now in her last illness they took shape again, and assassins lurked for her in the darkness and behind the curtains. So she lay for nearly 2 weeks, until lapsing into a stupor, she was carried to bed, where she died without speaking. The Archbishop returned to her at the end, and a movement of her hand was interpreted by her ladies-in-waiting as her consent to this presence. In these circumstances, the Tudor dynasty came to an end, which in 3 generations had changed the aspect and temper of England. They left a new aristocracy, a new religion, a new system of government. The generation was already in its childhood that was to send King Charles to the scaffold. The new rich families who were to introduce the House of Hanover were already in the second stage of their metamorphosis from the freebooters of Edward VI's reign to the conspirators of 1688 and the skeptical, cultured oligarchs of the 18th century. The vast exuberance of the Renaissance had been canalized. England was secure, independent, insular. The course of her history lay plain ahead: competitive nationalism, competitive industrialism, competitive imperialism, the looms and coal mines and counting houses, the joint stock companies and the cantonments, the power and the weakness of great possessions. What was in Elizabeth's mind as she lay there through the silent hours, sane and despairing? The thought of another England that had been in her hands to make? Or did she contrast her present state, an old perjured woman? Hang on just a second. An old perjured woman dying without comfort, with those early years when the future had been compact of hope and adventure. See the light on the river and hear again the splash of oars as Leicester's barge rode between green banks and pollarded willows. Now, this is a polemical book by Evelyn Waugh. It makes the case for England as a Catholic country, and it is a rather formidably anti-Protestant book. Why the connection? Why begin this book with Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen? Well, the reason is that Edmund Campion had first come to renown with a visit by Queen Elizabeth to Oxford. Edmund Campion was born in London in 1540. He attended St. John's College in Oxford, and he got a BA degree there and a master's degree in 1564. I should remind people that the origins of the universities and their purpose for many hundreds of years afterward was to train priests. So the Queen came to Oxford, and he led a public debate in front of her, and his eloquence much impressed the Queen. And he later became a favorite of William Cecil, the Earl of Leicester. He was a man who was, to use the modern phrase, he was a man who was going places. He was a man who, even after he had been captured and tortured, the agreement was put to him that if he were to renounce Catholicism, there was no limit to how high he could rise in the Church of England. Edmund Campion went to Ireland, and he wrote a history of Ireland at that time. Of course, histories were rather different then than they are now. That is to say, there's little that was known about the history of Ireland, and much of what was thought to be known was apocryphal. There was to be a university in Dublin, but the plan that Campion was involved in fell apart later. Of course, Trinity College was built there. In 1571, when Campion was 31 years old, he left England, not to return for some time. He went to Douai, which was then in the Spanish Netherlands and is now a part of France. And he became a Catholic there, and he attended the English College. Now, you may have heard of the Douai-Rheims Bible. The first version of that was written by Englishmen who had fled to Douai. There was an English college built there, and he got a Bachelor of Divinity degree, took minor orders, and he was determined to join the Jesuits. Now, Pope Francis is a Jesuit. The Jesuits are not the same now as they were. The Jesuits were kind of like shock troops of the Catholic Church of the Counter-Reformation, that they were known for their intellectualism. The order was founded by Ignatius of Loyola, who was a Basque priest. And this was an exceedingly rigorous order, rigorous intellectually. The Counter-Reformation, one of its goals was to reform the Catholic priesthood, which had become lax. And many Catholic priests were made priests simply because of their relations, being, the cadet sons of a family. Many of them were illiterate. Many of them were barely religious. The Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, determined that this state of affairs could not continue. So Edmund Campion he joined the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, and he worked for several years in what Waugh calls Bohemia. But he wanted to come back to England, and there was a mission that was raised in 1580. I should explain that in 1570, Pope Pius V, that is the same Pope of the Mass of Pope Pius V, the so-called Tridentine Mass, he excommunicated Queen Elizabeth, which was considered to be a shocking act. And from that point onwards, Catholics were seen, Catholic and traitor, those terms were regularly conflated. Let's see, this is what Waugh writes. In the spring of 1570, there occurred another event that completely recast the Catholic cause. Pope Pius V excommunicated the Queen. It is possible that one of his more worldly predecessors might have acted differently or at another season, but it was the pride and slight embarrassment of the Church that, as has happened from time to time in her history, the See of Peter was at this moment occupied by a saint. Pius was a Dominican friar of austere observance and profound spiritual life. As the Duke of Alva complained, he always seemed to expect events in the world to take place without human agency. He chose a life of great loneliness. He lived in a little set of rooms removed from the great state apartments of the Vatican. He confided in no one and took counsel from very few. The Turks were threatening Christianity in the rear. Her center was torn by new heresies. His allies were compromising and intriguing, their purpose distracted by ambitions of empire and influence. In long vigils of silent interior communion, Pius contemplated only the abiding abstract principles that lay behind the phantasmagoric changes of human affairs. He prayed earnestly about the situation in England and saw it with complete clarity. It was a question that admitted of no doubt whatever. Elizabeth was illegitimate by birth. She had violated her coronation oath, deposed her bishops, issued a heretical prayer book, and forbidden her subjects the comfort of the sacraments. No honorable Catholic could be expected to obey her. The Emperor, the Duke of Alba, the King of Spain were shocked at his decision. He consulted nobody. He acted without any regard to the events of the moment. He had heard of the rising of the Northern Earls and had been delighted with it. He did not know whether it had succeeded. Every government maintained its own secret lines of communication. His were far from efficient. It took 3 months or more for him to get a letter from England. He knew that there had been a rising and that by now it was probably decided one way or the other. Rumors had perhaps reached Rome of its failure. He did not wait to hear them. The formalities were observed. In the first week of Lent, a court of inquiry heard the evidence of 12 trustworthy English witnesses. Elizabeth was charged and found guilty on 17 counts. And on the 12th of February, Pius pronounced the sentence, which on the 25th was embodied in the bull Regnans in Excelsis. Elizabeth was excommunicated and her subjects released from the moral obligations of obedience to her. So the Jesuits decide to make a mission to England. Well, 30 priests go. And I should again repeat, there were a small number that survived, but these men knew very well what was in store for them. That they would be sold out by a professional informer, that they would be captured, that they would be tortured, they would be given a mock trial, and then they would be executed. So, Edmund Campion, he wrote an explanation of his acts. He says, whereas I have come out of Germany and Bohemian land, being sent by my superiors, and adventured into this noble realm, my dear country, for the glory of God and benefit of souls, I thought it like enough that in this busy, watchful, and suspicious world, I should either sooner or later be intercepted and stopped of my course. Wherefore, providing for all events, and uncertain what may become of me, when God shall happily deliver my body into durance, I supposed it needful to put this writing in a readiness, desiring your good lordships to give it your reading, for to know my cause. That doing, I trust I shall ease you of some labor. For that which otherwise you may have sought for by practice of wit, I do now lay into your hands by plain confession. He proclaims that he is a priest and a Jesuit, sent under obedience to England to preach the gospel, minister the sacraments, and instruct the simple. In brief, to cry alarm spiritual against foul vice and proud ignorance, wherewith many, my dear countrymen, are abused. I never had mind, and am strictly forbidden by our Father that sent me, to deal in any respect with matter of state or policy of this realm, as things which appertain not to my vocation, and from which I do gladly restrain and sequester my thoughts. He then states with extreme simplicity that the Catholic case is unanswerable. Up till then, the issue had chiefly depended upon sentiment, anti-Spanish feeling on the one hand, loyalty to tradition on the other. He now makes the claim, which lies at the root of all Catholic apologetics, that the faith is absolutely satisfactory to the mind, enlisting all knowledge and all reason in its cause, that is completely compelling to any who give it an indifferent and quiet audience. This is something which had been consistently denied to it by the Elizabethan government. Accordingly, he now appeals for a hearing before the Privy Council with regard to its effects on the commonweal, before the doctors and masters of the universities for its theology, and before the judicature for its legality. He concludes with a peroration, every sentence of which is aflame with his own fiery spirit. Many innocent hands are lifted up to heaven for you daily by those English students whose posterity shall never die, which beyond seas, gathering virtue and sufficient knowledge for the purpose, are determined never to give you over, but either to win you heaven or to die upon your pikes. And touching our society, be it known to you that we have made a league, all the Jesuits in the world, whose succession and multitude must overreach all the practices of England, cheerfully to carry the cross you shall lay upon us, and never to despair your recovery, while we have a man left to enjoy your Tyburn, or to be racked with your torments, or consumed with your prisons. The expense is reckoned, the enterprise is begun, it is of God, it cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted, so it must be restored. If these my offers be refused, and my endeavors can take no place, and I, having run thousands of miles to do good, shall be rewarded with rigor, I have no more to say, but to recommend your case and mine to Almighty God, the searcher of hearts, who send us his grace and set us at accord before the day of payment, to the end we may at last be friends in heaven, when all injuries shall be forgotten. Now, this boast, this brag, it seems rather insane to us. But at that time, 1580, religion was a very serious matter indeed. That people truly believed that it was the religious beliefs and practices which determined whether they were to spend eternity in heaven or eternity in hell. And so they acted accordingly. Campion in England, he dressed in disguise. He was given money. He traveled to houses where he said mass and heard confessions. Many of these houses had what they called priest holes, that places where priests could hide and where they could hide altars and the like. He visited many establishments in the course of the 3 months in which he was free. And then he was sold out, as I say, by an informer, arrested, taken to the Tower of London, and put in the infamous Little Ease cell. He was racked several times, and Waugh points out that just the threat of racking was sufficient to break men. even before the torture. Campion was later much anguished with the thought that he had given some information away during his torture. Waugh comes to the conclusion that it is likely that the information that he gave was information that the state had already, because a common prosecutorial trick then and now to tell lies during interrogations, to assume knowledge that one does not have, etc., etc. His trial was an absolute scandal. He was not allowed to have a defense. And he was asked exceedingly difficult questions about the theology of Christianity. Oh, and the people trying him made much of him, botching a quotation from Tertullian or whatever. He complained, especially when this charge of they invented a preposterous plot, rather Stalinesque in its absurdity, that Campion was supposedly involved in. And he ends this book with a discussion of his execution, hanging and then drawing and quartering. He writes, "It was raining, and it had been raining for some days, and the roads of the city were foul with mud. A great crowd had collected at the gates. 'God save you all, gentlemen,' Campion greeted them. 'God bless you and make you good Catholics.' There were 2 horses, each with a hurdle at its tail. Campion was bound to one of them, Bryant and Sherwin together on the other. Then they were slowly dragged through the mud and rain, up Cheapside, past St. Martin le Grand and Newgate, along Holborn to Tyburn. Chark plodded along beside the hurdle, still eager to thrash out to the last word the question of justification by faith alone. But Campion seemed not to notice him. Over Newgate Arch stood a figure of Our Lady, which had so far survived the Anglican hammers. Campion saluted her as he passed. Here and there along the road, a Catholic would push himself through the crowd and ask Campion's blessing. One witness, who supplied Bombinus with many details of this last morning, followed close at hand and stood by the scaffold. He records of how one gentleman, either for pity or affection, most courteously wiped Campion's face, all spattered with mire and dirt, as he was drawn most miserably through thick and thin, for which charity or haply some sudden moved affection, God reward and bless him. The scene at Tyburn was tumultuous. Sir Thomas More had stepped out into the summer sunshine to meet death quietly and politely at a single stroke of the axe. Every circumstances of Campion's execution was vile and gross. He began to make an exhortation. These are the words of St. Paul, English thus: "We are made a spectacle unto God, unto his angels, and unto men, verified this day in me, who am here a spectacle unto my Lord God, a spectacle unto his angels, and unto you men." But he was not allowed to continue. Sir Francis Knollys interrupted, shouting up at him to confess his treason. "As to the treasons which have been laid to my charge," he said, "and for which I have come here to suffer, I desire you all to bear witness with me that I am thereof altogether innocent." One of the council cried that it was too late to deny what had been proved in the court. "Well, my lord," he replied, "I am a Catholic man and a priest, and in that faith I have lived, and in that faith I intend to die. If you esteem my religion treason, then I am guilty. As for other treason, I never committed any. God is my judge. But now you have what you desire. I beseech you to have patience and suffer me to speak a word or two for discharge of my conscience." But this was not allowed. So an Anglican clergyman attempted to direct Campion's final prayers, but he answered gently, "Sir, you and I are not one in religion, wherefore I pray you content yourself. I bar none of prayer, but I only desire them that are of the household of faith to pray with me, and in mine agony to say one creed." They called to him to pray in English, but he replied with great mildness that he would pray God in a language which they both well understood. Now, yes, then he was hung. The cart was then driven from under him. The eager crowd swayed forward, and Campion was left hanging until, unconscious, perhaps already dead, he was cut down, and the butcher began his work. It's quite remarkable to think of a man like this and his mild response, his humorous response, when a mob is demanding that he pray in English rather than Latin. He says, that he would pray God in a language which they both well understood. I suppose one could say that Edmund Campion was a fanatic. That's not a word that I use, but I've quoted enough of his own words to show what a noble, gentle, and intelligent man he was. On Theater Thursday yesterday, I discussed of Xavier Beauvoir's film Of Gods and Men, which is about religious martyrs. And I quoted Miguel de Unamuno, and I will quote him here again to the same effect. Faith does not make martyrs. Martyrs make faith. Edmund Campion was in 1970 made a saint as one of the 40 English and Welsh martyrs. I think that his story is especially important now because this is a man who suffered torture and death in order to bring mass to the people. And we now live in a very strange age where the Catholic Church, led by a Jesuit like Edmund Campion, has decided that Catholics will not get the sacraments. So those are my thoughts on Evelyn Waugh's excellent book, Edmund Campion, and I will go to the chat. Adam says we're all born impulsive. Some of us never learn or find a reason to control ourselves. Spencer talks about authenticity and becoming who you are. In many ways, he's a throwback to the decade of me. Christopher Lash talked about this great thirst for authenticity amongst young people. He was talking about the 1970s, and he said that he correlated this to a population or a cohort which one would expect to find in a dictatorship and not a free country. Quachalango, I would like to hear KMG on authentic or inauthentic conversions to Catholicism. Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not a canonist or anything like that, although I will mention one thing. There was a neoconservative cult of Pope John Paul II. I'm not going to call him saint because he was the worst pope up to that time since the Counter-Reformation, that he was the man who personally brought down communism. And apparently he was a big fan of free market. Well, he was not the man who brought down communism. And he was no great lover of free market. But there were a fair number of well-known people who converted to Catholicism because of John Paul II. Of course, later, we discovered, well, I wrote about this while he was still alive, that, what it should say on his tombstone is he traveled while Rome burned. That he was an exceedingly vain man who just couldn't get enough of people screaming for him like a rock star. And he knew very well indeed the atrocious scandal, the priestly scandal of sexual predation, and he did nothing about it. In fact, he took steps to protect some of the worst offenders. So, okay. Lecomte de Brea says Jesuits were the most dogmatic Catholics. Well, there's a phrase associated with the Jesuits called Jesuitical, a form of casuistry. And by Pascal's time, Pascal certainly and Pont Royal, they consider the Jesuits to be phony Catholic. That is a very deeply involved story, which I didn't get into now, and I'm not going to get into. I didn't do it then, and I'm not going to do it now. John Miller says, "Who takes Q seriously? It's a perverted psyop." Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, wasn't it that Sessions, man, he was going to bring the hammer down on all perverts, right? There seems to be, a fair amount of panic in Hollywood, in the celebrity community generally. Because, as I say, if only 1/4 of the accusations made on Crazy Days and Nights are true, if the prosecution Hollywood will be leveled if this gets out. Anyway, I'm going to say good day to all of you. I will be back on the air Monday, Easter Monday, the 13th at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you like the show or any part of it, I would greatly appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already. If you wish to support this show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I'll leave you to Holy Week, to Easter Sunday. And this should be a time of community. It should be a time of joyousness, but it's not going to be. And again, I will wish you all most sincerely that in these days of total atomization, that you all manage to find some personal community. Goodbye.